Hello, everyone, and welcome to Mindscapes. I'm a cognitive neuroscientist who's just starting out in this field. I'm passionate about it, and I want to share this passion with others. So, my primary goal here is just to create videos that communicate findings, ideas, and problems in cognitive neuroscience. My goal is also a little ambitious because I want to produce content that strikes a balance between accessibility and depth. The benefit of accessibility is pretty straightforward. We all have brains, don't we? Therefore, we all stand to benefit from learning about them. Generally, regardless of your background, I want you to be able to engage with my content. So I'm going to do my best to explain things in a straightforward manner. However, that being said, I also believe that clarity should not come at the expense of depth. The goal is to break down concepts, not to water them down. Indeed, neuroscience communication, in my opinion, is all too often watered down into the platitude. Neuroscientists say XYZ thing, in quote unquote. I think this content is a knowledge equivalent of cane sugar. Yeah, it'll give you a quick high, but you'll also crash quickly. So consider, for example, the article in the top left. Take more outdoor walks. Neuroscientists say they're great for your brain. Just by reading this title, you're left with this impression that scientists, a kind of monolith, have placed their objective and impersonal seal of approval on outdoor walks. Well, my question is, if you're reading this and you trust science, why bother reading the rest of the article? I mean, really, you're better off just putting down the article and, well, going on an outdoor walk. In a nutshell, I think that all these quote unquote scientists say articles rely on the widespread cultural assumption that science is a kind of monolith, and that the scientific method is objective and therefore also impersonal. It's as if science, capital S science, is conceived of as a kind of machine, and it's as if scientists themselves are conceived of as operators of the machine, or even worse, just parts of the machine. However, if you ever do get to attend a scientific conference, you'll quickly learn that this is just not the case. Scientists are not like machines. Scientists have opinions, strong opinions, and they're almost always arguing with each other about these opinions. Indeed, cutting edge findings are almost always challenged, especially when they destabilize long standing theories. It's therefore a bit regrettable that popular science glosses over these debates. Not only do they misrepresent how science works, but they also miss out on a great deal of drama. But that being said, I also don't want you to come away with the impression that science is some kind of anarchic free for all. Yeah, it's true that scientists have opinions, that they're not machines, but they're still beholden to the scientific method. Their opinions can't be random or arbitrary. They must be consistent with observed experimental results, and these results must themselves be replicable, based on sound experimental design, and consistent with the wider body of accepted findings. Scientists are once again people, and just like any other group of people, they tend to be blind to their own errors. Because of this, problems in the scientific method are typically pointed out in the arena of debate. In this way, I hope you can appreciate how argument is pretty much a prerequisite to good science. It's not a bug, it's a feature. Likewise, even though science is no monolith, I don't want to give the impression that scientific consensus is not possible. Theories can receive the de facto approval of the scientific community, and this sort of consensus is extremely important when it comes to shaping policy, for example, in vaccines and climate change. However, the situation in neuroscience is a little bit more complicated. On the one hand, we do indeed have many points of consensus. For example, we understand that the brain contains cells called neurons, and that these cells transmit electrophysiological signals called action potentials. We understand that differences in the signaling of action potentials corresponds with differences in sensation and behavior. Let me provide a brief example so you have a better idea of what I'm talking about. So we have a special type of neuron in the retina, the back of our eyes, that transmits action potentials after being hit by light. These action potentials are then transmitted via the optic nerve to a region in the back of the brain known as striate cortex. We know that these action potentials are necessary for visual perception because when their transmission is blocked in a patient, perhaps due to damage to the optic nerve or to the striate cortex, then the patient suffers a blind spot or total blindness. In other words, the patient is not blind because of damage to their eyes. Fantastically, they're blind because of damage to the information processing systems that lie at the interface between the eye and the mind. More generally, scientists are in consensus over the notion that there exists some correlational linkage between information processing in the brain and cognition or mind. In this sort of correlational evidence, can we say that we understand how cognition works? The answer to this question would have to be a very resounding no. For example, we know that striate cortex is necessary for visual perception, but that doesn't mean that other regions don't play important roles in vision. Generally, just because something is necessary for some function doesn't mean that it's sufficient for it as well. Indeed, the brain is a massively complex organ with all sorts of feed-forward and feedback connections. It hosts countless units of information processing, which vary in scale from the single neuron to the whole brain network. There is even a possibility that non-neuronal cells called glia play a critical role in this information processing, and this possibility is very much a topic of current research. Aside from the inherent complexity of the human brain, there's also a deeper, more fundamental problem associated with correlational evidence in the first place. Ultimately, correlation does not really describe how something works. For example, let's say that scientists have discovered the neuronal code that corresponds with visual perception of apples. I have an example here, and of course, in reality, the code would be much more complicated than a simple 3-neuron code. But my point here is more demonstrative. Indeed, I want to demonstrate that the mere revelation of the code does not explain how the code mechanically results in the mental state apple, or indeed of any mental state at all. This question is really one of fundamental importance to cognitive neuroscientists such as myself. We're interested in the problem of cognitive emergence. That is, how does biology, or neuronal encoding more specifically, result in the emergence of mental states, of cognition, of mind? To provide evidence for this emergence, it's not really good enough to just say that neuron X correlates with mental state Y. Correlation, once again, does not provide a mechanistic explanation for emergence. Correlation does not describe the how. So maybe the larger point here is that cognitive neuroscientists, such as myself, have really tasked ourselves with a pretty spectacular challenge. In previous times, the top stuff used to be the exclusive domain of psychologists and philosophers, at least within academia. The bottom stuff, the brain, was the exclusive domain of clinicians and biologists. The challenge that we have is not only to bridge these two domains, but also, really fantastically, to evidence that there really is a bridge. Indeed, it should come as no surprise that some philosophers question the very existence of this bridge. They might concede that there's some correlational linkages between brain and mind, but they'll insist that they're fundamentally different, that brain cannot produce mind. The opposite of dualism is monism. It's the view that brain and mind are not fundamentally separate and that brain can produce mind. Cognitive neuroscientists are naturally invested in monism because the very term cognitive neuroscience implies such a linkage. And at this point, you're probably wondering, well, who's right? Well, it's no small question. I mean, you might have guessed it yourself, but the question of emergence is not so different from the question of consciousness. It doesn't make sense to tackle such an immense question in an introductory video. But here, I more just want to point out how these sorts of big questions lie at the very heart of cognitive neuroscience. And I just want to say that they're going to keep on popping up pretty much on every video that comes out of this channel. With this in mind, I'll just reiterate that any article starting with the words scientists say is really doing you a massive disservice. This sort of content only scratches the surface. It gives you an illusion of clarity by avoiding the big questions that, once again, lie at the heart of cognitive neuroscience. Ultimately, I don't think people are all that interested in little factoids like, scientists say, go for outdoor walks. I think that people in the long run want content that makes them question the nature of their minds, the nature maybe even of their reality and of their lives. After all, that's why I got into this field in the first place. Above and beyond the questions that I put on the last slide, there's another question that's even more important. It's not just going to appear in every video, it's actually going to pretty much motivate every single video on this channel. And the question is pretty simple. It's, what is it like to be a human being? What's it like to be a me? What's it like to be a you? What fundamental commonalities exist in our experience of the world, the self, and the relationship between these two entities? Granted, the first thing I have to do is prove to you that there really are fundamental commonalities in our experience. And I have to show you that cognitive neuroscience might hold a key to revealing them. This is going to be the major goal of my second video. Finally, in my last video, I'm going to introduce a more original idea, something that I'm pretty passionate about and something that I want to make the focus of my career. The idea is that part of what it is like to be a human being is to have a kind of strange and specific relationship with history. I don't mean like literally things that have happened in the past history. I mean the act or the mental experience of thinking about history. And I propose that history, as a mental experience, might constitute a kind of inescapable and fundamental lens from which we view the world, or maybe even more radically, a landscape from which we orient ourselves. And so yeah, once again, this question is definitely a passion of mine. It's definitely original. As far as I can tell, no other cognitive scientist has considered it. So you can expect that a lot of my videos on this channel will focus on this question. Finally, I want to tie up some issues surrounding cognitive emergence, that bridge between brain and mind, and perhaps also consciousness. We ended on a somewhat depressing note. Indeed, the note was that neuroscientific evidence, which tends to be correlational in nature, might not be good enough to evidence a causal link from brain to mind. Going a step further, I would encourage you to think about how this question of emergence is a bit all or nothing. It resonates with that all or nothing nature of consciousness itself. If scientists are able to answer it, then they've pretty much solved the problem of consciousness. The issue, however, is that scientists have certainly not solved the problem of consciousness. There are theories of consciousness for sure, but there's certainly no consensus in the field. So, given this state of affairs, can we conclude that cognitive neuroscience has little value in elucidating the link between brain and mind? My answer to this question would be no. I think we can still make progress in cognitive neuroscience by just shifting the question or shifting the goalpost. Instead of asking, how does the brain produce subjective experience? We can ask more indirectly, how does the brain structure or set the parameters of our subjective experience? This is really like asking in a more, in more piecemeal fashion, how does the brain shape aspects of what it is like to be human? And finally, I hope this shows to you why I really love this question, what is it like to be a human being? It's not only just like inherently interesting to every human being out there, it also provides a means for making real and tangible progress in cognitive neuroscience. It allows us to circumvent that infinitely mysterious hydra, the question, what is consciousness? Indeed, it might also help to explain the phenomena of consciousness in the first place. So this is a fun little closing thought for you. But I wonder if part of what it is like to be human is to attribute consciousness as an all or nothing thing in the first place. What do you think?